Ladies and gentlemen, real quick video with doctors Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard C. Miller. I was asked by someone who's been following MythVision for a while that, they see what's called Midrash, and maybe we can let you guys explain what that is. And then there's Mimesis, which is a pioneered idea that Dennis MacDonald, if you look on Google what Mimesis criticism is, he's the guy behind the name. I wanted to ask just a simple question, and that is the New Testament doing Midrash, or is it doing Mimesis? And that's kind of a funny question because I'm wondering if it does both. If you don't mind, Dennis, take us off on what you think's going on there. What's the difference between Mimesis and Midrash? And is the New Testament doing both?
Oh, the New Testament definitely is doing both. Unfortunately, biblical scholars have been more attentive to Midrash than they have to Mimesis. And there are reasons for that, and we've talked about that in a different podcast. But the first thing we need to do, I think, Derek, is to determine what we mean by Mimesis and what we mean by Midrash. They are both intertextual projects. They are all both creative. But Mimesis is interested in taking a recognized text and changing it for certain reasons in order to do what I would call syncresis, what the Greeks call syncresis, a comparison of characters, so that Jesus is superior to Moses, if it's a mimesis of Deuteronomy, let's say, or Jesus is superior to Hector. They both die heroically, but Jesus rises from the dead, that kind of thing. That is a very different project from Midrash. Midrash really doesn't have very many rules, but it has a tradition. And it recognizes a text, but it doesn't try to imitate the text. It tries to interpret the text by aligning it with a different text or coming out with an alternative interpretation of it. In both cases, though, both Mimesis and Midrash have to do with using a contested authority. That is, it could be Greek poetry in the case of Mimesis, or it could be Jewish scriptures in the case of Midrash, as a way of establishing for a community what is going to be its dominant ideology or its leadership. So when Paul, for example, engages in Midrash, by the way, he doesn't do Mimesis. When he's engaged in Midrash, it's usually in a polemical context where scripture is being contested, and he's giving his interpretation of it and applying it as an authority, an authoritative interpreter. And we know from his epistles that there are other contenders to be authoritative interpreter in order to reshape their understanding of Torah, let's say, for example, or community identity, or the relationship to non-Jews. So when I was the director for 10 years at the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity at Claremont Graduate University, where Richard got his PhD, by the way, I tried to put together a conference on Mimesis and Midrash, because both of them are ancient intertextual projects that deal with contested authorities in different ways. And I found it really impossible to pull that conference together because it was difficult to get scholars in these two fields to talk to each other reasonably. There were funding issues as well. So that's what I would say, that Midrash is a intertextual project that isn't interested in imitating a text or challenging it or comparing characters. It's rather a way of reinterpreting an episode, a mitzvah, a commandment, in order to make it congenial to new situations. And one way of doing it is to compare it with another biblical text that sometimes challenges it or reinterprets it or whatever. Midrash is less a science than an artistic game one plays to re-scramble the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle in order to create a different image. It's got its own rules, I suppose, but it's not easy to formalize. It really is more of a creative, literary, theological game.
Did you want to add anything to that, Rick?
I would just say, just the bare observation, I think if you go back into these excerpts and quotes that are given in the New Testament from the classical Hebrew writings, the Septuagint, the LXX, they enjoyed it. They were afforded an astonishing freedom and creatively were drawing on this apparently authoritative body of texts in their cultic communities. And I'm not sure to what extent, it does not feel like the authors and the early cult leaders were held to much standard in terms of what we would consider to be purely Jewish context. We have these early cults within the urban centers in the Hellenistic world, communities that may not have been terribly interested in holding their leaders to certain Jewish standards of that day in terms of how they're handling those texts. But they did, I think, take comfort, if you read in Justin Martyr, this idea that we're drawing on these older texts that have this deep, archaic history to them, and that was a comfort, I think, to the early communities that were there, that their traditions, the religion that they were receiving, the cult that they were investing themselves in, was able to draw from these older roots in some way. To what extent were the leaders faithful to any of those texts? Well, that's where we come in with Midrash, right? We kind of give them that license there. But I think more work needs to be done to unpack, how does this compare with what we would consider more normal, if there is anything normal going on with Midrash in early Jewish writing and thought at that time? I would say that I think what look I've taken with that, what investigation I've had with that, is that this would be maybe on the poorer end of that spectrum. I think if we're fair and honest with ourselves, there are some creative moments, however, that I think are a little bit more what we would consider higher quality Midrash in there. But I think more or less they were just using it as a license in order to draw on the earlier texts. And I would argue that the audience, those that were there reading and digesting and consuming these texts, were not holding them to much standard in that regard. And so that's where my research has gotten to this point.